Eastern Airlines Flight 401 departed New York's JFK Airport on December 29, 1972, bound for Miami International Airport. It was a routine flight scheduled to arrive just before midnight. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the most advanced wide-body jets of its era, equipped with state-of-the-art autopilot systems and redundant safety features. The crew was experienced, the weather acceptable, the aircraft mechanically sound. Captain Robert Loft commanded the flight. At 55 years old, he had logged over 29,000 flight hours and had a reputation as a meticulous, safety-conscious pilot. His first officer was Albert Stockstill, a 39-year-old pilot with extensive experience on the L-1011. The flight engineer was Don Repo, a 51-year-old veteran of Eastern Airlines with deep technical knowledge of the TriStar's systems. The flight proceeded normally until the approach to Miami. As the crew prepared to land, they lowered the landing gear. A green indicator light, which should have illuminated to confirm the nose gear was down and locked, failed to light. This wasn't necessarily an emergency. The light bulb itself could have burned out while the gear was properly deployed, but confirming gear position was critical. Captain Loft made the correct decision. He radioed Miami Approach Control, reported the issue, and requested to enter a holding pattern over the Everglades while the crew diagnosed the problem. Air traffic control approved. The aircraft climbed to 2,000 feet and entered a wide orbit over the darkened swampland west of Miami. Captain Loft engaged the autopilot to maintain altitude while the crew focused on the landing gear issue. What happened next would later be identified as a cascade of small errors, each individually survivable, that combined into catastrophe. First Officer Stockstill and Flight Engineer Repo removed the green indicator assembly, trying to determine if it was simply a burned out bulb. Captain Loft focused on the troubleshooting, momentarily distracted from monitoring the flight instruments. The autopilot was engaged for altitude hold, but the particular mode selected required active monitoring. A slight deflection of the control yoke could disengage it without any warning. At some point, someone inadvertently bumped the control yoke. The autopilot disengaged. The aircraft began a slow, gentle descent. In the darkness over the Everglades, with no visible horizon and the crew's attention focused on the landing gear problem, no one noticed. The altitude alert system should have warned them when they descended below their assigned altitude. But that system had a quirk. It could be inadvertently disabled if someone pressed the altitude selector knob in a certain way. Investigators would later determine this had occurred, though exactly how remains uncertain. For several minutes, Flight 401 descended gradually toward the swamp below. The crew continued troubleshooting in the landing gear, discussing the problem, completely unaware their aircraft was no longer maintaining altitude. An air traffic controller noticed the decreasing altitude on radar and queried the flight. "How are things coming along out there?" Captain Loft responded, "Okay, we'd like to turn around and come back in." The controller approved, but the brief exchange didn't alert the crew to their danger. They still believed they were at 2,000 feet. They weren't. They were barely above the swamp. At 11:42 p.m., Flight 401 struck the Everglades at 227 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated, scattering wreckage across the swamp, the violent deceleration and destruction claiming lives instantly. Of the 176 people aboard, 101 died, including Captain Loft, First Officer Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Repo. The survivors, 75 passengers and crew, owed their lives to the swamp's soft terrain absorbing some impact energy, and to the heroic rescue efforts of first responders who navigated the treacherous Everglades at night. The crash investigation revealed the sequence of errors: the burned out indicator bulb, the inadvertent autopilot disengagement, the disabled altitude alert, the crew fixation on troubleshooting that prevented them from monitoring basic flight parameters. It wasn't mechanical failure or weather or pilot incompetence. It was a tragic example of how small oversights can compound into disaster. The investigation led to significant changes in aviation protocols, improved altitude alert systems, enhanced crew resource management training, better cockpit design to prevent inadvertent control inputs. Flight 401's tragedy made flying safer for everyone who followed. But for some Eastern Airlines crew members, Flight 401's story didn't end in the Everglades. The salvage operation recovered substantial wreckage, including components that were still serviceable. This was standard practice. Perfectly functional parts from crashed aircraft were routinely salvaged, inspected, certified airworthy, and installed in other aircraft. It was economically sensible and, from an engineering standpoint, perfectly safe. Eastern Airlines salvaged numerous components from Flight 401, including avionics, galley equipment, seats, and various mechanical assemblies. These parts were installed across Eastern's fleet of L-1011 aircraft over the following months. According to multiple witness accounts that would later be documented, the apparitions began soon after. The first reported sighting occurred within weeks of the crash. A flight attendant working in the galley of an Eastern L-1011 looked up to see a man in an Eastern Airlines captain's uniform standing in the galley area. She didn't recognize him and found his presence unusual. Pilots rarely came to the rear galley. Before she could speak, he vanished. Later, when shown photographs of Eastern's pilots as part of the investigation into her report, she identified the man she'd seen. It was Captain Robert Loft. A second incident involved a flight engineer conducting a pre-flight inspection. According to his report, he observed another flight engineer already performing checks in the engine compartment. The figure turned toward him. They made eye contact, and the engineer recognized Don Repo, a man he'd known personally, a man he knew had died in the crash. Before he could react, the figure disappeared. These initial reports might have been dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations if they'd remained isolated. They didn't. Over the following months and years, reports accumulated. Flight crews, pilots, flight engineers, flight attendants reported encounters with apparitions they identified as Loft and Repo. The sightings occurred on multiple aircraft, witnessed by multiple crew members, sometimes by individuals who'd never met the deceased pilots and could only identify them from photographs. One particularly detailed account came from a flight from Newark to Miami. A flight attendant working in first class noticed a man in an Eastern captain's uniform sitting in an unoccupied seat. She approached to ask if he needed anything. The man turned toward her, his face clearly visible. She later described feeling an immediate sense of unease, not from his appearance, which was normal, but from something intangible about his presence. When she checked the passenger manifest, no captain was listed as a passenger. She mentioned this to the other flight attendants, and one of them came to verify. The second attendant also saw the figure. Together they notified the flight crew. The captain and flight engineer came back to first class. According to their reports, they both saw the figure sitting in the seat. The captain recognized him immediately. Robert Loft, a man he'd flown with, a man he'd attended the memorial service for months earlier. As they watched, the figure faded from view. Not suddenly, not like someone walking away, but gradually becoming translucent and then simply absent, like a video fade to nothing. The captain, shaken by the experience, filed an official report with Eastern Airlines. The incident was documented, though the airline was reluctant to publicize it. But word spread through the flight crew community. Pilots and flight attendants talked among themselves, sharing experiences, comparing notes. Another incident involved a captain conducting a pre-flight walk-around inspection. As he examined the nose gear, the same component whose indicator light had failed on Flight 401, he saw Don Repo standing nearby, watching him. Repo spoke, according to the captain's account, telling him to check the nose gear more carefully. Then he vanished. The captain did inspect the gear more thoroughly and discovered a hairline fracture in a component that could have led to gear failure. The aircraft was grounded for repairs. The captain was certain that without Repo's warning, the problem would have gone undetected until catastrophic failure occurred. A flight attendant reported seeing Repo's face appear in the glass door of an oven in the galley. The apparition spoke, warning of a fire risk in the electrical system. She reported it to the captain, who had maintenance inspect the aircraft. They found faulty wiring that could have caused an in-flight fire. Not all encounters were beneficial warnings. Some were simply observations, crew members seeing the apparitions in passageways, galleys, or cockpits, with no apparent message or purpose. The figures would appear, be observed, and disappear. One particularly unsettling incident involved a vice president of Eastern Airlines. He was traveling as a passenger on a Miami to New York flight, seated in first class. He later reported seeing a pilot in uniform seated across the aisle. He didn't recognize the man, but thought nothing of it. Deadheading pilots frequently traveled on company flights. Later in the flight, he struck up a conversation with the pilot. They discussed flying, routes, aircraft. The conversation was completely normal. Only as the flight prepared to land did the vice president look over to find the seat empty. Confused, he asked the flight attendant about the pilot he'd been speaking with. She insisted no one had been in that seat the entire flight. The vice president recognized the man from photographs. It was Don Repo. The accumulation of reports became concerning for Eastern Airlines management, not because they believed in ghosts, but because crew morale was affected. Some flight attendants requested transfers off L1011 routes. Some pilots expressed reluctance to fly certain aircraft known to have salvaged parts from Flight 401. Eastern Airlines management faced a delicate situation. Publicly acknowledging the reports would invite ridicule and could damage the airline's reputation. Dismissing them outright would anger crews who felt their experiences were being invalidated. The compromise was quiet investigation combined with practical action. The airline brought in specialists, not ghost hunters, but psychologists and aviation safety experts, to interview crew members who'd reported experiences. The goal was to determine if there were psychological factors, stress-related issues, or safety concerns that needed addressing. What the investigators found was troubling from a skeptical standpoint. The witnesses were credible, consistent, and showed no signs of psychological distress or attention-seeking behavior. They were experienced aviation professionals reporting what they'd observed, often reluctantly, aware of the professional risks involved. Meanwhile, Eastern Airlines made a practical decision. They began removing salvaged components from Flight 401 and replacing them with parts from other sources. This wasn't officially acknowledged as a response to the apparitions, but the timing was notable. According to accounts from crew members and investigators, the sightings diminished significantly after the salvaged parts were removed. Aircraft that had been sources of multiple reports suddenly had none. The pattern was consistent enough that even skeptical observers noted the correlation. Those who believed the Flight 401 apparitions were genuine manifestations of loft and repo point to several compelling elements. First, the specificity of identification. Witnesses who'd never met these men identified them from photographs, described uniform details, rank insignia, physical features. Second, the protective nature of many encounters. Warnings about mechanical issues, assistance during emergencies, as if these deceased crew members were continuing their safety responsibilities beyond death. Third, the correlation between salvaged parts and sightings. Apparitions occurred on aircraft with Flight 401 components, ceased when those components were removed. The quality of witnesses is particularly notable. These weren't random passengers prone to suggestion or misidentification. These were trained professionals, pilots with thousands of flight hours, flight engineers with deep technical knowledge, flight attendants experienced in managing unusual situations. Their careers depended on sound judgment and accurate observation. The fact that multiple witnesses sometimes observed the same apparition simultaneously is significant. Shared hallucination is possible but rare. When a captain, flight engineer, and 2 flight attendants all report seeing the same figure at the same time, individual psychological explanation becomes less convincing. The warnings about mechanical issues are perhaps most compelling. In at least 3 documented cases, apparitions allegedly warned of specific equipment problems that were subsequently verified. From a believer's perspective, this suggests consciousness surviving death and manifesting to prevent further tragedy. Skeptics, however, offer comprehensive alternative explanations. The most fundamental centers on grief and suggestion. Flight 401 was a traumatic event for the entire Eastern Airlines community. Over 100 people died, including respected crew members. The psychological impact on surviving colleagues was profound. In this context, misidentification becomes likely. A glimpse of any pilot in uniform, seen briefly or peripherally, could be mentally processed as a deceased colleague, especially by someone experiencing grief or stress. Once initial reports circulated, suggestion would amplify the effect. Crew members would be primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli as apparitions. The correlation with salvage parts doesn't necessarily support supernatural explanation. It could simply reflect awareness. Crew members knew which aircraft contained Flight 401 components, creating psychological conditions where misidentification was more likely on those specific aircraft. The expectation of seeing something unusual makes you more likely to interpret normal events as unusual. The multiple witness sightings are more challenging for skeptics, but not insurmountable. In group psychology, particularly in high-stress situations, individuals can influence each other's perception in real time. If one crew member reports seeing something, others present might experience confirmation bias, interpreting ambiguous visual information in ways that match the first person's report. Regarding warnings about mechanical problems, skeptics note that these aircraft underwent regular inspections. Problems were frequently found and corrected as part of routine maintenance. The apparition warnings in this view didn't predict problems. They motivated more thorough inspections that found issues that would have been discovered eventually anyway. The reports of conversations with apparitions, particularly the vice president's account, are explained through false memory construction. The executive may have briefly dozed, dreamed a conversation, and later constructed a waking memory of the interaction. This is a well-documented phenomenon, particularly during long flights when fatigue and light sleep cycles are common. From a skeptical standpoint, the case represents a fascinating example of how workplace culture and shared trauma can generate persistent belief systems. The apparitions served a psychological function. They transformed a senseless tragedy into something meaningful, suggesting that loft and repo continue protecting crews even after death. This narrative was comforting, reducing anxiety about flying aircraft of the same type that had crashed. The airline's decision to remove salvaged parts, whether motivated by supernatural concern or simply by desire to improve crew morale, inadvertently reinforced the belief system by correlating with decreased reports. This doesn't prove the apparitions were real. It proves that addressing crew concerns, regardless of their supernatural or psychological origin, was effective. What remains genuinely mysterious is the documentation. Eastern Airlines kept internal records of these incidents. Some of these reports were later obtained by researchers and journalists. They show that even the airline's management took the reports seriously enough to document them formally, conduct investigations, and ultimately take action by removing salvaged components. The case attracted significant media attention in the mid-1970s when author John G. Fuller published The Ghost of Flight 401, which documented many of the reported sightings. Fuller interviewed witnesses, obtained incident reports, and built a comprehensive case file. His work brought national attention to the phenomenon and sparked broader discussions about consciousness, survival after death, and unexplained phenomena in aviation. The book was controversial. Believers saw it as validation. Skeptics saw it as sensationalism. Eastern Airlines refused to officially comment, neither confirming nor denying the accounts. This silence was interpreted differently by different audiences. Believers saw it as implicit acknowledgement. Skeptics saw it as unwillingness to dignify unfounded claims with response. Several of the witnesses Fuller interviewed maintained their accounts for the rest of their lives. They never recanted, never claimed misidentification, never expressed doubt about what they'd experienced. For them, the encounters were as real as any other aspect of their aviation careers. Interestingly, as L-1011 aircraft aged and were eventually retired from Eastern's fleet in the 1980s and early 1990s, reports of Flight 401 apparitions effectively ceased. Whether this was because the aircraft themselves were no longer in service, because cultural memory of the crash faded, or because something about those specific aircraft created the conditions for manifestation, remains debated. What we're left with is a case that resists simple categorization. Was Flight 401 haunted by the crew who died trying to solve a technical problem? Crew members who continued their mission of safety beyond death? Were dozens of trained aviation professionals victims of shared grief and suggestion, creating apparitions from trauma and expectation? Was there something about salvaged aircraft components that created electromagnetic or psychological conditions conducive to unusual experiences? Those who believe in the paranormal see Flight 401 as one of the best documented cases of post-death consciousness. Multiple credible witnesses, specific identifications, protective behavior, correlation with physical objects. These elements create a compelling case for survival of consciousness and its ability to interact with the physical world. Skeptics see a textbook example of how trauma, grief, suggestion, and workplace culture can generate persistent belief in supernatural events. Every element, they argue, can be explained through psychology, misidentification, and the human tendency to find meaning in tragedy. Perhaps the most thought-provoking aspect isn't whether ghosts are real, but what the Flight 401 case reveals about human psychology in the aftermath of trauma. Whether the apparitions were genuine spirits or psychological projections, they served a function. They transformed crew members from passive victims of tragedy into active participants in preventing future disasters. They made death meaningful by suggesting it wasn't final, that dedication to safety transcended physical existence. The families of Loft and Repo had mixed reactions to the reports. Some found comfort in the idea that their loved ones continued to serve and protect. Others found the reports exploitative, a sensationalization of their grief. Both responses are understandable and reflect how differently people process loss and meaning. The legacy of Flight 401 extends beyond ghost stories. The crash itself led to crucial safety improvements that have saved countless lives. The psychological aftermath revealed how aviation communities process trauma. The apparition reports, whether supernatural or psychological, demonstrated the need for better support systems for crew members dealing with grief and workplace tragedy. Today, the Everglades crash site has been reclaimed by nature. Small markers commemorate the lives lost, but the swamp has healed over the scar of impact. The L-10-11s that once bore salvaged parts from Flight 401 have been retired, scrapped, their components recycled into other purposes or preserved in museums. Captain Robert Loft and flight engineer Don Repo are remembered in aviation history not primarily for the apparition reports, but for being dedicated professionals who died in the line of duty. Their legacy is the safety improvements that came from understanding how their crash occurred, ensuring the same cascade of errors could never happen again. Whether their consciousness survived to warn and protect subsequent crews, or whether grieving colleagues created that narrative to cope with loss, becomes almost secondary to the fact that their deaths meant something, changed something, prevented future tragedies through both mechanical improvements and through the cautionary tale their flight represents. The question of what crew members really saw on those Eastern Airlines flights may be less important than the question of why those experiences resonated so deeply, why they were reported so consistently, why they mattered enough to remember decades later. In that resonance lies something true about human nature. Our need to believe that dedication continues beyond death, that those who die serving others continue that service, that tragedy can transform into protection. Whether that makes the ghosts of Flight 401 real or simply makes them necessary is a question each person must answer based on their own understanding of consciousness, death, and the persistence of purpose beyond physical existence. What's certain is that something happened on those aircraft, whether in the external world or in the collective consciousness of those who flew them, that transformed a crash site in the Everglades into one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. The silence from Eastern Airlines' official records, the careful removal of salvaged parts, the documentation that exists in internal files but was never fully disclosed. These elements create a mystery that transcends simple belief or disbelief. In that space between what was documented and what was acknowledged, between what was experienced and what was explained, the ghosts of Flight 401 continue to fly.
We made it out of this one, but the darkness runs deep. If you think you can handle it, check out the other cases on the channel. Don't risk losing the signal. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. The next investigation is starting now.